BAM is a communications agency that believes stories move the world. We move stories forward for technology-driven brands that challenge, change, and create entire industries. Today we have Nikki Parker, Vice President at Insight, on the show. Nikki is a technology enthusiast, avid communicator, and a fitness, food, and travel aficionado. Let's dive in.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining the Dear BAMf podcast for PR marketing pros such as yourself. Nikki, we're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Yes, we got some good questions. We're going to dive in. Let's start with our first one here. Dear BAMf, my client is only interested in speaking and attending top-tier industry events, however, does not have the connections or profile to be considered. What are ways to build a profile, especially now that many events have been canceled?
Okay, that's definitely something I have heard a number of times where expectations and reality don't necessarily line up. And I think that word expectation setting is critical here. You know, it's our job as PR professionals and communicators to often start with a company that doesn't or a CEO or an executive that doesn't necessarily have a profile, is looking to build out what they stand for, and has really lofty goals. And I think that's I think that's great. And it's our job to lay out those lofty goals, set where we're heading, and then show our CEOs or our clients or the executive team what are the steps that we're going to actually have to take to get there. And then hold them accountable and really help push the conversation along so that you can build up a presence and that you can build up a profile that you are getting asked to speak at different events. So the first thing I would do when you're discussing events is, I'm sure, Beck, you've had this a million times. I want to be on the front, on the main stage of TechCrunch Disrupt.
Today,
that would be great. And you kind of look there and you're like, well, there are a few things we need to do first. So I think, though, doing that groundwork up front of asking your client, where do you see yourself? What are the conversations that you see yourself entering into? And also understanding what is their experience. What you'll find from that kind of initial conversation is that potentially their expectations, they'll realize it themselves. They'll be like, oh, yeah, I haven't really participated in too many events, or all I've done is a webinar or two. So maybe, by having that initial groundwork conversation, that's where you can start to set expectations and help them see the work that they're going to need to do. Then I would say, so let's map out what the work is. I think you sort of said does not have the connections or the profile. And I think they're two different things.
Yeah.
So the connections, obviously you as the PR professional for your client, that's something that you can work on. So definitely start to, as a PR professional, understand what different events are out there, understand the who's who on setting up these events. And in the same way that you would with editors or journalists, get a feel for what they're focused on. What are the conversations they're interested in? And you should be a person that is able to bring those connections to your client.
That's right.
It's important. Like, I'm sure, Beck, you get your team to talk about and look and map out all the different events that are going on.
Yeah. And that's also why you're hired.
Totally. Exactly. So you bring that knowledge to the table. And there's also other, which we can talk about after, in this whole events have now been cancelled world. There are a lot of other players, such as corporates and brand partners, that are now hosting their own events. Everyone's becoming an event coordinator. So there's an extended network, not just your classic Bloomberg events or TechCrunch events that you might go after. Mm-hmm. But so on the second part of building a profile. So I think the first thing there is, like I said, to map out what do they want to talk about? Are they an authority on that? And then begin to build out some places that you can point event coordinators to so that they can see that your client is truly an authoritative voice on that topic. And for a lot of CEOs, they haven't put in that work and they just feel that their voice is an important one in the mix. And that might be the case, but without a precedence to, point an event coordinator and say, no, look at him talking in thought leadership in certain outlets, or, hey, look at the blog that my client writes every month on this topic. they've got a following, or they're just very passionate in the space, and I can clearly show you that they're there. And then also the other thing is the classic sizzle reel.
Yes.
And, it sounds, just sizzle reel sounds like it's the 1980s wants their word back. But it's really important that, and it's almost like when you get your first job. How are you supposed to, they say, well, we only hire people with experience, but then how are you supposed to get experience until you have experience?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Working with and Beck, you've probably done these as well, is maybe work with your client and host a mini event of your own. Find ways to create the content that you might need to package up a sizzle reel to help get your foot in the door, and then map out some of those smaller events, whether it be with partners or customers, or even just more vertical and trade-focused events that might be an easier place to start, to really just explain to the CEO that success will beget success, and we need to get you some visible examples so that we can begin to have conversations with the top-tier events.
I think what's so telling in this note here is my client is interested. Yeah, well, I'm interested in 6-course, 5-style dinners, but what is feasible is a whole other situation. So to your point, the expectation management, also the grounding to, hey, what are we starting with? If we're starting with 0, 1, the reason you were hired was for those connections. 2, they ought to do the work on the profile part. But with that said, you got to be starting somewhere. So the smaller events that you can insert into, the ones where you can create one so that you can lead that, great. These are the things that you can be doing to then build that profile, and then even have an expectation that eventually you could be on that stage where 1,000 people are attending. There's so many examples of this with people just having the expectation that you're like, wow, like that's just not even feasible. And perhaps here in this case, we've done this a number of times. This is a moment for education where you can say, okay, client, yeah, you know what? Here's client A, B, and C example. And it took this long for this one. It took this background for this one. And it took just so that you're educating this, because so often they're not aware necessarily of what does it take to get that whole feature in the Wall Street Journal? What does it take to actually get on stage? How long did that take? Even seeing a little blurb in a gift guide in O Magazine is months in the work. Sometimes there's a lot of education here to then help the expectation.
That's the magic of PR and communications, is that for those who don't, work in the industry, it just appears. Well, the funding announcement that we just did, it just appeared. And they don't know about the 3-week embargo strategy that went on behind the scenes. So,
yes. Well, let's go on to next question here. Okay, Dear BAMf, I'm an internal head of comms at a well-funded, rather huge startup. I have 2 others on my team, and that's it, while the engineering team, as you could guess, is more than 100 people. Recently, I've overheard one senior engineer discredit our work, saying, speaking of what we were just talking about, Nikki, saying, why does this press release even matter? Seems like comms is just for puff for our investors, end quote. This is the same person who once asked us if he could review an article before it was published in Bloomberg. I explained how this isn't the case and how media works. Have you dealt with naysayers in the past? I'm slightly concerned that his negativity and lack of understanding for our function will spread to others up the chain.
Yep, exactly what we just spoke about. And honestly, I think, this podcast can be therapy, because this is a challenge that I think every communicator goes through. I led marketing communications at a very fast-growing startup. We went public, and technology startup, and our growth rates were huge, and we were really focused on growth. And so as a result, we had, I would say, 80% of the organization was engineering and brilliant technologists, really, really smart people. And the CEO, he himself was an engineer by trade, but incredibly brilliant technologist. Thankfully, he had an appreciation for PR and communications, but that's not always shared amongst engineering teams. You've got to think that they come at things from a very black and white, very logical perspective. They are there to build and grow, and there's also, as an engineer, you're building a product, you're extremely proud of it, and there is an expectation that everyone else will recognize that, and that there's no room for conversation or debate or discussion. So why does communications even need to play into this? our work, our product, our, company, it speaks for itself. So that is often what you're coming up against. And so, everyone who's listening, don't be disheartened. Marketing communications is a really, really critical piece of a business. And increasingly, we can talk about this I don't even know if this is a question, but a later question, especially in today's current climate, how we communicate is really, really critical. So I think, the first way I would say to address this after you've held your head up and kind of brushed off all of the criticism or negative words is education. And we've mentioned it previously. And I think that a key piece here is you're the internal head of communications. We need to increase this, elevate this conversation above media relations.
Yes.
We often drill it down into specifically a conversation with a reporter to get a piece of press. Mm-hmm. But it is so much more than that. It is, who are we as a company? What are our goals and our missions? How are we building this and doing this? What are we changing? And then explaining all of the nuances of what makes your company unique. And I can guarantee you an engineer is going to have a lot of opinions on that. And it's synthesizing that into something that is relevant. And then it is using media relations as one tactic to communicate that. Mm-hmm. By educating at a much higher level and then drilling it down into the channels will be a first place to start. The second piece I would say is that you hope that negativity doesn't spread up the chain. I think the most important thing there is get ahead of that. You're the head of communications at a well-funded and rather huge startup. So there are other people within the organization. Get allies and go to them with an explanation about an education on what is your function and how are you going to support, because ultimately at the end of the day, marketing is a support role for a business and business objectives, and communications is the mouthpiece for the organization. So everything we are doing as marketing and comms professionals is in service of our business. So if you start to use that language, it's not defensive, it is a service role and I guess, function. If you start to use that language and show people and bring people along the journey of not only you're there to help, here's how you're going to help, and here are the amazing results that are going to happen because of your help, you're going to start to build very powerful alliances up that chain that, the naysayers, there are some people you're just not going to get through to. They operate in code or they think in a different way, and that's okay. So don't spin your wheels with them. Focus where you can win.
The only thing I'd add to that, I agree with everything, is to, especially in our current environment, extend the olive branch a little bit. I'm not saying you got to bend over backwards and pacify this person anyway, but say like, oh, hey, maybe it's unclear, hey, what my role is. And you know what? I don't know totally what your role is. I would love, let's have a learning exchange here, so I can really get what's on your plate every day. By the way, that might be helpful for my job to really understand and promote that. And then you can also learn from me. See if that person's open to that.
You can try. When I worked at a cybersecurity firm in DC, I'm talking deep bowels of cybersecurity, that I was cone of silence on my roof of the building, and I would spend so many hours. And a lot of my engineers were ex
CIA people
that were some of the stuff that they talked about was just wow, and that's a podcast for another time. But I would spend hours literally in my pajamas, because that was kind of some of the work culture, but sitting on the floor and having them teach to me and preach at me essentially about their technology and their views of the world. And I've always joked that my career, I never was in marketing and communications. I started my career in kind of innovation solutions and bringing tech products to market, because I could translate an engineer into human. So I used to joke nerd into human. And make it have relevance and make it fit in a sort of a more macro conversation. But to do that, I really needed to, like you said, Beck, extend the olive branch, get in deep with them. It really helped me understand where they were coming from. And it gave me a level of authority as well when I did have a point of view about why we needed to communicate something in a specific way that might have been at odds with how they thought. So I think you're right. You're kind of talking with, we've got two different roles that are speaking two different languages.
Yes. Next question here. Dear BAMf, I've been fighting tooth and nail at my company to keep our agency on board. The agency has been going above and beyond during this pandemic and has been successfully securing placements I honestly didn't think would be feasible. My CEO, whom I report to, says that our company just doesn't care, quote, right now, unquote, about press and media attention. I know we're in the middle of this pandemic, but I think this is so short-sighted, and I would hate to see my agency cut because the quote unquote right now rationale. What's your advice here?
It's a tough one because I had never worked in an agency. So 13 years of my career, or 11 years of my career, I was running internal in-house marketing, communications, investor relations. Then, and I think I'd probably hired and fired probably 15 to 20 PR agencies in my time. Then I took a job at a PR agency, and I really got to see a different side of, I do think that I was a fairly good client at times. You know, there are dynamics when you work in an agency that are super challenging, and the loss and the win of the clients comes with the territory. But so what I would probably do and dig a bit further with my CEO here is, what is the real root of this point of view? And, you know, he said, I don't think people care right now. I think you'd need to drill into that a little bit more and make sure that your CEO, that there aren't maybe potentially financial reasons.
I was just going to say, is this actually financial?
Exactly. Like, just make sure that there aren't other things going on that you need to be mindful of, because at the end of the day, it is business and you'll need to kind of toe that line. But if the conversation keeps coming back to our clients or our customers don't care right now, that's where I would stand up and I would push back. And I think I mentioned it earlier in the podcast. Now more than ever, people care what our corporations and what our businesses and what the companies in our ecosystems are doing and saying. And also not just because of what we're saying potentially about the current climate, whether it be COVID or Black Lives Matter, two very important and very all-encompassing conversations, but also how we're talking about our business in general. Are we talking with empathy? Are we talking with authority, with learning, even just about our business and where it fits in the global ecosystem? So I do agree that it would be short-sighted, but I think you need to get to the root of the question. And I'd also come back with, if what we are talking about in the media isn't, you don't think is resonating with our end target audience, and maybe now is the time that you do need to pivot and focus on other things. Maybe because right now the customers aren't caring in the middle of a pandemic, we should be preparing for when we do come out of this. There is a lot of other things that can be done. And I think that you might just need to educate your CEO a little bit on the work that would need to go in.
The other thing, too, is how does the CEO know this? Because this person says, the CEO, oh, our customers just don't care right now. How did you derive to that? Did you hear it from two people? People get some little inkling or hear one opinion and then they assume, oh, that is factual. Whereas there's actually no data, or it's so fragmented that your brain just played a trick on you and has now made it a fact. Where in fact, there's actually no real standing of where that came from. So I'd really push back and go like, oh, that's so interesting. So what have the customer, how do we know that they don't care? Was there a survey? Did we talk to 100 of them? Where are we hearing that? Because if it's just one investor on the board that says you need to cut that budget, that's a very different thing.
Definitely. I think it also, like, this is a much bigger, and it's, you know, the question of the ages for PR professionals is how to get executives to care about PR in the first place. And in some respects, you know, it's so in having clout and generating a conversation has such values to a company, brings such value to companies and executives. But oftentimes if a CEO or a person in a position of leadership doesn't see that, very hard to bring them along for that journey. But I agree with you that pushing back and asking them for, okay, so where did you hear that? Mm-hmm. Could be a very, very powerful tactic.
My other favorite is, the competitor, like they're just everywhere. They're all over the place. And you go, okay, was that one article you saw this weekend? Or actually, have you seen 27 pieces that actually merit that assertion? These are the things.
It's a very emotional reaction.
Yes. We're trying to get reaction out of here, especially right now. Okay. Next question here. Dear BAMf, I work with a founder who thinks he's great with media and won't take the time to receive media training. From my experience, I fear he will go off script for media interviews and say something that could end up published. How can I convince him that media training is an important use of his time? Where have I seen this before?
I know. Media training, and I've worked with a lot of CEOs, both as my CEOs that when I was in-house and then also supporting them as a PR agency support partner. I think that media training is something that some people will relish and will really want the opportunity to improve, and that's wonderful. But I would say overwhelmingly, a lot of CEOs feel that they don't need it. They talk about this thing all the time. I start with different tactics to help them see that maybe a little bit of training wouldn't be such a bad thing. And as we all know, a way to, the ways to influence people to act is there's carrots and there's sticks. So I've used both tactics. So from a carrot perspective of, being the nice PR person, something that I do is I'll bring out other pieces of media, and maybe it's from competitors. Beck, you just mentioned, our competitors are everywhere. So if you can play a little bit into that, that's great. And bring out the headlines and showcase the quotes that get shown. Because the key thing, as we know with media relations, is short, sharp sound bites that allow you to control the conversation and to make sure that you put out the messaging that you really want to be in an article. And so I think by talking and showing CEOs that and saying, look how powerful this statement was, look how powerful this headline was, and then ask them some questions. What do you think, what would you say to get, if I asked you, what is the value that you bring your core customers? What you'll often find is a 3-minute rambling explanation. And then you say, this is something that I personally, when I was media trained, I really learned how to talk in these types of powerful sound bites. It's really not it's not how we usually talk. So by listening and hearing and getting taught this tactic, you could become a really, really, really powerful media spokesperson. So kind of leading them on that journey that they could get better. Then on the flip side, there is the fear tactic and the stick. the stick. I've been lucky enough to work in sort of in the tech space, but also in the cybersecurity realm, where we worked with a number of companies and a number of CEOs that there were a lot of crisis situations. And I've also run crisis communications for a number of years. The fear is real. And I think that particularly if we look at, things that get escalated to a crisis situation or get escalated to a board conversation, for instance, it is critical that CEOs, as the leaders, are prepared to respond and respond well. I would recommend looking at whatever industry you might be in, looking at it with a crisis lens and map out, here are the 3 worst things that could potentially happen. And if they do, we need to be prepared to respond and to, make sure that you can, hand on heart as the CEO, look your board in the eye and say that you are best prepared. Then we should just tick this box and we should do some media training. I know you're great, and CEO, you're probably one of the best media spokespeople I've ever worked with, but this is it's protection. It's insurance that we have done everything that we can to make sure that we're prepared. Then obviously when you go into the media training, you'll focus on the full gamut of media responses. Mm-hmm. So they'd be my, think about the carrots, think about the stick, and think about what motivates your CEO. And another tactic I've used, actually, last one, is jealousy. If you've got other people in the organization that are also great media spokespeople, or maybe it's other executives, host a media day which is for more than just the one person that you really think needs the media training. By bringing everyone else in and making it not so much competitive, but making it a shared experience and one that either this person can come and shine because they're such a media darling, or just one that they will want to come and participate in. So that could be another tactic.
Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of the stick, personally. The approach we often do, and it's so, God, there's so many great examples just from a quick Google search of total bombs of people on live TV, just spiraling, frankly, out of control to the point that it's now a YouTube clip that's watched predominantly across the world. So showcasing that, and it's not to say that's going to be you, but hey, this is what happens when there's not media training. You know, it's like, here's your brain on drugs, that whole like campaign. Here's your impression, not media trained. We want to avoid that situation, right?
Definitely.
Yep. That'll wake people up real quick. Okay. Last question, Nikki, for today. Dear BAMf, my client wants to have their quotes and bylines included in top tier outlets. Do you have suggestions on how to make a client's point of view stand out from other thought leaders in the same industry, especially when their name isn't recognizable?
Another classic problem. And I think that, this is particularly challenging when you're trying to build a name for your client or for a CEO or for an executive that you work with. And mainly because when you're building a name, it kind of comes with a lack of experience, I guess. And they'll often be more hesitant to really put themselves out there and to make a statement or to take a stance. And there's probably going to be just less comfort with this whole process. So we've said it a million times, but clearly we are not just communicators, we are educators. And everything that we need to do is about thinking through it from the lens of our client or from our executive and helping bring them along that journey. So ultimately, to get your name out there or to get pick up in a press, you do need to say something that stands out and that is relevant and that maybe takes a contrarian point of view. But I will preface everything that I'm about to say with make it authentic to who you are as a spokesperson or who you are as a business. Don't just say wild stuff like Elon Musk just for the sake of getting headlines. That will bring us back into the last bucket of talking about crisis communications and media training. So don't do that. But I do think you need to kind of stick your neck out a little bit if you're going to get your personal point of view or business personal point of view out there. Without having that, then I think data is your only tactic. So really come to the table with a relevant data study, some relevant data points from potentially within your community, and talk about them. Because as we know, media really do love to have a data point to refer to. And I think that that's something which you can generate that would be unique, that would give your executive the opportunity to begin to have a dialogue and bring in their own personal points of view as well.
This is another classic case, as we've mentioned before, and to your point, Nikki, data is where you can point to that, because if this is someone who just doesn't have the traction, it's going to be hard to compete with folks that have had the legendary or long-standing experience in the space. What we often have seen is, to your point, okay, what's the third-party places and information that we could point to? So this, you're mentioning here, this person writing in like, oh, my client. Now, we don't know if it's like the CEO or the founder or whatever, but maybe the client is the company. The company wants to be seen with a specific point of view. So if that's the case, not only is it data, but is it something else where it's board members that they can bring on? Is there partnerships that can bring them that authority and that voice, versus spending a lot of time and making headway into their industry for years and years, because that does take time. So you can accelerate it a bit by using the third parties, via that be a survey with the information you find, be it a partner that you can data scrape and find some insights for, maybe some board members, advisor people that you could bring to the forefront that are partnered with you. That's probably your best technique. The entity itself, again, we don't know if it's a person or if they're referring to a company here, doesn't have a leg to stand on too much. Very classic case, though, with a lot of startups.
Very classic case. And I also think the last thing I'd add on that is, which kind of ties up everything we've talked about, is make sure that everything that you have that's discoverable about your business, about your executives, really tells the story you want to be told. Because if you're going out and you're pitching a reporter, or if you're talking to a reporter or an events person and saying, hey, my CEO is fiercely passionate about farming, and there is nothing on your, whether it be your executive profile on your website, on their LinkedIn, on their Twitter feed that's about farming, then it's going to be a hard, pill for a journalist to swallow and say, you know what, this person's probably an authoritative voice on farming. So I think you just need to really think about things holistically, because reporters will do their research and they're going to want to talk to, people that really do not only bring a different point of view or data point or partner, but are a source that when their readers or when people that attend an event go and Google who they just heard or who they just read about, that there's an authentic foundation on why their point of view matters. So I think you need to just think holistically here, versus just a media hit or an event win, and start to think about the story we're really trying to tell as communicators.
Nothing kills us more when it's, I want to be a thought leader. I want to do all this stuff. And you're like, wait a second, you haven't done a single blog post since 2018. What are we doing here? I mean, if you haven't even shown that voice, it's a very hard ask to then suddenly become that, because to your point, they do their research, they're going to look. And if you've got bare bones or God forbid nothing, no, it's not going to happen.
Yep. Got to do the work.
That's a great way to end that. You've got to do the work. And that's why you bring on comms people to get you there. Well, that's it, Nikki. We've solved everything.
We've solved all the world's problems.
At least for now. Thank you so much for being on. This was so great.
You are very welcome, and chat soon.
Thanks for listening to Dear BAMf, the advice podcast for PR and marketing pros like you. Our show is created by BAM, a PR and marketing agency headquartered in San Diego and New York City. The music you're enjoying today was composed by Tiffany Dizon, produced by Daniel Kessner, and played by San Diego Symphony's Art of Alon. Thank you to our podcast production team at Citizen Recording. If you have a tough PR and marketing question you'd like us to answer, please write to us at bamtheagency.com/Dear BAMf. Don't forget the F. We'll be back next Monday with another episode of Dear BAMf. Until then,